Good evening. As we come tonight for Good Friday, nothing on my end has gone right. And you know what? That's exactly what the disciples felt like. They Good Friday with Jesus. Nothing had gone right. But Jesus, who was still in control, even through all the chaos, through the craziness, he still knew that God was in control. We left off Sunday where the Sanhedrin had arrested Jesus and they brought him all the way to Caiaphas' house. And I was there. And that was where they had a mock circus trial. And they trumped up accusations and blasphemies against Jesus. And in the end, they asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "Yes, I am." That's all they needed to hear. That's all they needed to hear. So they took and they rushed him then on to Pilate. Now it said this was the first thing in the morning that they rushed him to Pilate. They came and they arrested him in the Garden of Gethsemane at about midnight, which means he had been at Caiaphas' house all night. There is actually dungeons at his home. We had a chance to go down into those dungeons, and probably Jesus had been in a holding cell. And it was while he was there, again, this was probably about 6 hours that he had been there, and Peter was trying to hear what was going on, but he couldn't get inside, so he was in the courtyard, and we stood in the courtyard. The very person who said he would never deny Jesus, Jesus said, "You will deny me 3 times before the cock even crows." And Peter was so fervent about not. He said, "There's no way I would do that. I would die for you." And while he's standing there in the courtyard where I stood, a lady came to him and he says, "Aren't you with him?" And he says, "I tell you, I don't even know the man." Not once, twice. And then just as dawn was about to break, Peter fervently denied that he even knew Jesus. "I tell you, woman, I've never met the man." And the rooster crowed. Peter, his very best friend, had just denied him. And Jesus was probably just off in that cell, not too far away, probably within earshot. Well, first thing in the morning, they grab Jesus and they take him off to Pilate. And it is a walk. They get to Pilate and they bring him before Pilate and they said, "This man is accused of treason. We want him tried and basically hung," but they wanted worse. So Pilate takes him in and he questions him. He says, "Really, I can't find anything wrong with him." But the Sanhedrin are insistent that he pay for his crimes. So Pilate, knowing that because of the big feast that Herod was actually there. Herod has 5 temples and palaces, and he was actually in Jerusalem at that time. Now what he didn't know was Herod's temple, or his palace, I say, was actually sitting, he built it right on top of David, King David's palace. I had the opportunity to stand there too. And it's a ways. And so down the hill, they took Jesus to Herod's. Now, this is interesting, because when Jesus goes to Herod, I don't know if you realize, but if you remember the name Haman at all, does that ring a bell? Haman was the villain in the story of Esther. And Haman is the one who tried to not only have Esther killed, but all the Jews along with it, not knowing that Esther was a Jew. The same very Haman is the lineage that Herod comes from. Now Herod, the Antipas who's there, was his father, who he stood next to 33 years before that, when the wise men came 30 years, when the wise men came in search of the Messiah, a king. And it was that very Herod that stood there with his father, and he saw him give the order to go out and kill all of the 2-year-old babies and under, to eradicate any threat of a king. But they didn't get Jesus. And now Jesus is standing before the son, Herod. And Herod's intrigued. He doesn't realize that this Jesus that's standing before him is the very one that his father tried to kill. But you know he's got to be thinking and doing the math in his head. And he's got to be wondering, whatever happened? Did we get that king as a baby, or is he still out there? He hasn't tried to overthrow him yet. But he's heard about this Jesus, and he's interested, and he wants to see signs and miracles, and he has the power to let Jesus go. And Jesus just stands there. Among all the questioning, the barrage of questions and wanting answers and wanting to see him perform signs, and finally they get mad and they get upset, and they've mocked him and they ridiculed him, and Herod's had enough. He sends him back to Pilate. And so Jesus has to make that trek all the way from David's palace. And think about that. David's palace. The lion and the lamb. Both. Right there in the same place. He makes that trek all the way back to Jerusalem. He's standing before Pilate again, and Pilate's he's kind of beside himself because he really doesn't think Jesus has done anything. But the Sanhedrin are pressuring so much on the political side. So he says, okay, I tell you what. He says, every year I let a man go. But this year, I'm going to give you a choice. Either Jesus or Barabbas. And Barabbas was a notorious, it says, criminal. He was a murderer. He was a thief. He was horrible. Pilate picked him because he just knew the throngs and the crowds that had followed Jesus, that surely they would pick Jesus over Barabbas. Now there was a reason why there had to be two this year that had never been done before. Because at Yom Kippur, the holiest day, the Day of Atonement, the day when all sins were eradicated, there was 2 goats that had to be identical in nature. And the priest would bring the 2 goats, and lots would be shuffled and cast, and one lot would go to the sacrificial goat, and the other lot would go to the escape goat. And the escape goat would be left off into the wilderness along with the sins. Now this has been done every year. And this year, as Jesus stands before Pilate and Barabbas, there had to be something identical. Barabbas' name literally means in Hebrew, Bar means son of, and Abba means the father. Barabbas' very name is son of the Father, and Jesus is what? Son of the Father. Son of God. 2. Identical. Well, the crowd, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, they get the crowd all riled up and they're screaming, Barabbas! Barabbas! Pilate then has no other choice but to release Barabbas. Now, Pilate's wife, in this interim back and forth between Herod and back, he had married a woman from Rome, and she was a seer, which means she could see the future. And she says, I've had a dream, and she's extremely troubled. And she says, it's this man Jesus, had nothing to do with him. Because not only have I seen the destruction of you, but I've seen the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Rome. She is very upset. And Pilate says, Caesar says to them, he says, what do you want me to do with this Jesus? And they scream, crucify him! Now there's an interesting side note to this. As I was doing a bunch of research, they have uncovered, they've excavated a letter from Pilate to King Tiberius. And while scholars think most of it is probably very true and accurate, one of the interesting things that I found out in this reading, it's his commentation back and forth between Tiberius after all the events of Jesus. And he starts talking about Jesus and the different times that he's had the opportunity to witness him. See, Jesus was not a threat to Rome, because in no time did he ever talk bad about Rome. In fact, he criticized the elite. He criticized the Pharisees. He criticized the Sanhedrin. And in fact, Pilate said he was there the day that somebody spoke up and said, "Should we pay taxes to Caesar?" And this piqued his interest. And Jesus said, "Render up to Caesar what is Caesar's, and up to God what is God's." I want you to think about that for just a moment. God gave me a wonderful revelation. Had Caesar acquitted Jesus that day, he would have become Caesar's. He would have been indebted to Caesar. But that wasn't to happen, right? He had to render up to God what was God's, and that was his son. So he listens to the crowd, and they're screaming violently that they want him crucified, which was only left for the severest of punishments because of the nature, the torture, the length, the suffering. He knew Jesus did not deserve this. In fact, he even tried to persuade him differently, but they became so violent that he agreed. So he ordered Jesus to be flogged. Now, the severity of this was enough in itself. To be flogged was to be whipped with 12 to 16 strands of leather that come out with metal hooks on the end. And 40 times they hit him with those 12 to 16 hooks that ripped the flesh from him every time they beat him. And when they were done, the soldiers took him over and they stripped him and they put on a scarlet robe and they fashioned a crown of thorns. And I've actually seen the tree of the crown of thorns, and it's a wiry, spindly branch that's very pliable, so you can wrap it around many times and twist it and tie it, but the thorns are nasty. And they made a crown of it because he was king of the Jews, and they shoved it on his head. And after whipping him with a reed, put it in his hand as a scepter and mocked him as king of the Jews. Afterwards, they took the scarlet robe off of him, put his clothes back on, and then they took him towards Golgotha. Now there's another mystery with the crowns, because he was king of the thorns. In the beginning, there was the Garden of Eden. And because of man's fall, that garden turned to thorns. There were thorns from sin. And Jesus has now become king of those thorns, king of the curse from Adam and Eve, king of sin, king of the broken, king of the pierced, king of the wounded, king of the rejected, Lord of the fallen, king of the thorns. They took off the robe, as I said, and they put it back on him. And as they start to lead him out, the Gospel of John says that he carried the cross all by himself, but the other three Gospels say that there was a man from Cyrene. This man was an African man. He stood out in the crowd. Everybody remembered him. It was different. They didn't pick a Jew from right there in Jerusalem to carry his cross. They picked an outsider, which in itself says a lot. Jesus died for all, even the outsiders. And this man from Cyrene, he carried Jesus' cross from that very spot with Pilate to the hill of Golgotha. And it would be a hill, it's an incline. But it's not what people think on a hill far away. Actually, Golgotha Golgotha is a skull in the stone. You could see the eyes, you could see the nose. And it was underneath that hill where they actually crucified the thieves. And they did it on purpose because right at the bottom of that was the intersections of two main highways that went in and out of Jerusalem. One leading to Tiberias and the other leading to Damascus. And they wanted it to be on that spot where everyone could see the accused. Everybody could mock him. Everybody could spit at him. Everybody could throw rocks at him. Everybody could just witness the horror of being accused. And hopefully the deterrent from it as well. They have actually uncovered the holes and the plugs that fit in the holes of not 3 but 4 holes where the crosses would have been placed. Now this is way below now where you can see. But isn't it interesting, on that very day there were not 4 that were crucified but 3. Because Jesus had to be in the center. Had there been 4, there would have been no center. Now I have walked that Via Dolorosa, the little windy, narrow path on the way to Golgotha. And if you've ever visited the Holy Sepulchre, they say everything happened within the walls of that church. But I'll just personally say, by logistics, that's virtually impossible. As Jesus gets to the Golgotha, to the skull, there's another thing that's going on at the same time. This is the time when the priests get ready at 9 o'clock in the morning for their first sacrifice. Now, I don't know if you realize, but time right here in this story is not only a miracle, but a mystery in itself. Everything that we have talked about so far, everything that we have recounted right up to this point, from when they left Caiaphas' home to when they got to Pontius Pilate, maybe at the earliest is 6 o'clock in the morning. And then he sends him all the way over to Herod. And then from Herod he comes all the way back to Pilate. And then there's another jury, and there's another trial, and then he brings out Barabbas, and then they choose, and then they take him, and they flog him, and they beat him, and he carries his cross all the way to Golgotha. This all happens by 9 o'clock in the morning. Time would have almost had to stand still. And there is a reason why it had to be at 9 o'clock in the morning. Because at 9 o'clock in the morning, the priest would bring in the sacrificial lamb, that they would blow the trumpets and they would slaughter the lamb. They would blow the shofar. And then after that lamb was slain, then they would do all the other sacrifices within that time until the final lamb would be sacrificed at 3 o'clock. I can just see and hear as those soldiers are getting ready to hit that first nail into Jesus' hand in the distance. Sound of the hammer hitting the nail. The first lamb is sacrificed. Jesus is nailed to the cross, both his hands and his feet. And that cross is lifted up, and I said there are holes, there are plugs there for it, and this cross is lifted up, and as it jars into that hole, we can hear him say, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." If you would turn into your hymnals to page 555. And join with me at this time as we sing, "O Sacred Head, Now Wounded." Time passes. People mock, they spit, they jeer. And the women and the disciples, they mourn and they weep. Pilate has a sign in 3 languages, not 1, not 2, but 3. Posted above him, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Sanhedrin are furious. They want it removed. It's the last stab at them. It says, what I have written, I have written. The thieves also mock him. He saved others, he even brought Lazarus back from the dead, and yet he can't even save himself. At some point, though, the other thief says, don't you fear God. We are getting our just, but this man has done nothing wrong. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And through the pain and the agony of just surviving, Jesus manages to tell him, I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. At noon, darkness covers the whole land. The sun has quit shining and the earth shakes. There's earthquakes so severe that many things have been noted and written down through the ages. In fact, one of the most notable was while the priests are up there, the shaking has happened and the golden doors is separate to go into the Holy of Holies. Those are shaken and now they are open. And up until 40 years later, it says that the doors would never shut again. They've been blown wide open. Another thing happens. It says there was a curtain, and the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies, which was so big, it was 4 inches thick, and it was 5-6 stories high, and probably 60 feet wide. But there was something on it that we don't know. There were 2 cherubims that were embroidered on this curtain. The same cherubims that were on top of the Ark of the Covenant that used to be in the Holy of Holies. The same cherubims that separated man from the Garden of Eden with the flaming sword. When the earthquake happened, not only did that curtain rip in 2, but it ripped in 2, dividing those cherubims, opening wide for us to come before God. Everyone knows that something is up. But they're afraid to admit it. They're afraid to admit that this just might have something to do with Jesus. Jesus cries out to the Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? They rush with vinegar and myrrh. He says, I thirst to fulfill the scriptures. If you would turn to page 560 and join with me. We'll do all 4 verses.
He fixed his
Jesus now looks down in the Gospel of John. It says he looks at his mother and he looks at his beloved friend John. And he says, "Mother, your son. Son, your mother." Even in the midst of the grueling pain and the anguish and the trouble that it is even to breathe, he is still making sure that his mother is taken care of. When one is put on the cross, the weight, even if they're tied, the hanging suffocates the person. It is such a chore to even try to breathe. They have to push up on their legs to try to catch their breath. And then their chest falls again, never to really be able to release all of the air. The Jewish day begins at sundown on Thursday to sundown on Friday. All of this that took place started at the Last Supper on Thursday, the 24 hours, and it carries through Friday at sundown. The sixth day. The sixth day is known as the Day of Man. Jesus accomplished everything on the sixth day. It has now come to 3 o'clock. And again, I can just hear, in the not so far distant, the priests blowing the horn for the last sacrificial lamb. With that, Jesus raises his head and says, "It is finished." Jesus became the guilt offering. Those 2 lambs were the guilt offering. And he had to endure that cross for those 6 hours, between 9 to 3, to be the final guilt sacrifice. The person who knew no sin became sin for all. At this time, they take and they look. It's getting closer to dark. It's getting closer to the Sabbath. And the criminals cannot remain on the cross by the time it hits sundown. So to speed up the process, as I said, they hang there, trying to grasp their breath. So as mercy, they take hammers and they break their legs. So they have no platform of which to rise, to breathe. And as they come to the two thieves that are hanging on the cross that are still alive, you can hear the crunching of each of their bones. But when they come to Jesus, they look and they see and they think he's dead. And so the soldier takes the spear and shoves it into his side, which releases blood and water, and they realize that he's dead. This was to fulfill the scriptures that no bone would be broken, and that they would look upon him who was pierced. And this is going to get into another story at another time, but there was another reason for the piercing of Jesus' side. Because that blood came down his body. All the other blood had been trickling down, but this blood gushed down the side. And it came down the side of the cross and down into that hole that was holding the cross. And then the earthquake that had shook, that had split the earth open, that blood continued to trickle down. God does nothing by happenstance. It is all for a reason. Seeing that he is dead, they take him down off of the cross because it's starting to get sundown. And it is at that point that Joseph of Arimathea, a very rich man, he goes to Pilate and he knows it's getting close. So before this has even happened, he goes to Pilate and he's pleading that he would give him the body of Jesus. Because he had a brand new tomb. And this tomb that was hewed out of stone, they had to go in from solid stone and not just chisel a doorway, but chisel out this entire tomb. And while it was unbelievably painstaking and took a long time and was very expensive, that tomb would be used over and over and over again. But nobody had been in this tomb yet. It was a new tomb. And Pilate agrees to give Joseph the body of Jesus. And so he goes back, and it says Nicodemus is with him as well. Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to him by night, another night, in secret. Another night in secret. And he asked him what he must do to enter in the gates of heaven, and Jesus says, you must be born again. And he accepts Jesus on the spot. This very man comes with 100 pounds of spices, aloes, and myrrh. Now this is written in the book of Luke. With Jesus, they take him down. They lie him in the tomb. It says many women on all four Gospels. Many women are standing outside and they're watching all of this. As they lay Jesus in the tomb, they get ready to roll the stone in front. There was not time to prepare the body. John says that they had time to wrap him up and put 100 pounds on him, but they might have just started the process because it had to be done before the Sabbath. It was impossible to have it all done in time. As we stand here, sit here, and we think about Jesus being lowered from the cross and getting ready to enter in that tomb, I would ask that you would turn to page 561 and join with me in Were You There? And we're going to do just the first through the first through the 4 verses, just the first 4. From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 59. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewed in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the sepulchre. It was at that time, the next day, the day of preparation, that the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor said, while he's still alive, that after 3 days I will rise again. Therefore order the sepulchre to be made secure until the third day, lest the disciples go and steal him away and tell everyone he is risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be far worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it secure as you can. So they went and they made the sepulchre secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard.